Welcome to Windows on the World, bringing you cutting-edge news, empowering information, and no conspiracy theories. On tonight's show... Okay, so this week on Windows on the World, we're going to look at some of the issues that I've been putting into articles over the past few weeks, because they contain some very, very important information that people need to know about. We're going to start off with the Counterterrorism Security Act 2015, which came into force in July this year. Now, this gives local authorities certain new powers, which we're going to talk about, and we're also going to question local authorities' competence in using these powers. Councils are already banning certain websites from libraries, and these websites hold no extremist views whatsoever. They're interfering with the lives of people, and we know they're getting paid to foster out children as corporate parents, and we know that they're enforcing Agenda 21, which is a worldwide global action plan implemented locally. We've featured this on Mini Holland schemes equals fake green fascism. And interestingly enough, the borough of Walthamstow, which is one of the places targeted for this Mini Holland scheme, there's been quite a lot of backlash against it because obviously the public weren't consulted. This is all Agenda 21, and people need to look into Agenda 21. We've got many videos of that on the website. There's an article, United Nations, IMF and Vatican Cabal, which gives you the links of how this really is working, how these organisations like the IMF, the UN and the Vatican are all working together for this global action plan known as Agenda 21 or Sustainable Development. But now, within this Counterterrorism Security Act bill, councils now have the power to re-educate citizens. And for those unaware of how much power councils in the UK have assumed over the past years, this information might be a bit of a surprise. So the Counterterrorism Security Act 2015 states that local authorities now have a statutory duty to form panels which will be instructed by local police to deal with those who are vulnerable to extremism. So what you've got here is police who think they may have identified someone vulnerable to extremism. Now, vulnerable to extremism is very, very broad, and they actually state that they are not necessarily targeting people who are outside the law. So the Counterterrorism and Security Act 2015 states that local authorities have this duty, and that's important. It's a duty, and they are obliged to do this. So this is from a Prevent strategy paper. Now, Prevent is a government's set up organisation. This is the Prevent Duty Guidance for England and Wales, and this can be found in the article Counterterrorism and Security Act 2015 if you want to see the links. That's on the website windowsontheworld.net. So it says here, we believe that Prevent work to date has not clearly recognised the way in which some terrorist ideologies draw on and make use of extremist ideas which are espoused and circulated by apparently non-violent organisations, very often operating within the law. So this is very interesting. They're talking about non-violent organisations operating within the law, and they're now targeting them. So that could mean anybody. It says here, we will not change the law. We remain committed to protecting the freedom of speech, which many of those extremists set out to undermine. So you can see where this is going and how they're trying to twist it. But it says here, but preventing radicalisation must mean challenging extremist ideas that are conducive to terrorism and also part of a terrorist narrative. Challenge may mean simply ensuring that extremist ideas are subject to open debate. So some of that's a little bit ambiguous, but what's very interesting is that they're now including non-violent organisations who are operating within the law. So obviously this means anybody and everybody can be included. It also states that police will be lawfully disrupting or attending events involving extremist speakers in both private and municipal establishments. Now that's quite a bit of a leap. So now you've got local police looking at who's speaking and what events are going on. Now, I don't think we're really talking here about extremism. I think we might be talking about people who maybe oppose the council or have different views than the consensus big society which is being imposed on us. And I think this is where it's going. So with Cameron in reality defining anybody with an alternative view as a terrorist, it's all starting to make sense in the world of the big society. So there's also some links in this article which are worth looking at, this prevent strategy, and there's another one called contest, which is another government strategy document. Now, all of this is actually in the article, the excerpts from the Counterterrorism Security Act. I'll just go into what it says here. Assessment and support local panels. 1. Each local authority must ensure that a panel of persons is in place for its area, with the function of assessing the extent to which identified individuals are vulnerable to being drawn into terrorism, and with the other functions mentioned in subsection 4. Now, identified individual in relation to a panel means an individual who is referred to the panel by a chief officer of police for an assessment of the kind mentioned in subsection 1A. Okay? A chief officer of police may refer an individual to a panel only if there are reasonable grounds to believe that the individual is vulnerable to being drawn into terrorism. Well, again, we're talking pre-crime here. Anybody can be drawn into anything, and it's all down really to the opinions of the police here. They have to prepare a plan in respect of identified individuals who the panel considers should be offered support for the purpose of reducing their vulnerability to being drawn into terrorism. If the necessary consent is given, to make arrangements for support to be provided to those individuals in accordance with their support plan. Now that's very, very important. Everything within this system relies on consent. So what would happen if the consent of the individual is withdrawn? Well, it says the necessary consent is refused or withdrawn to the giving of support under a support plan. Then the panel has determined that support under a plan should be withdrawn. That's another clause in here. Basically what they have to do is review the whole thing, and then they can bring in social services or healthcare professionals. So that's where it's getting a bit sinister, but I think all this really needs to be contained, and people need to learn how to deal with people in public office in councils. Councils are not competent to make these decisions. They're not generally competent to make most of the decisions that they are making. So I think it's very important here that we remember one of the 9 rules of policing, that the police are the public and the public are the police. So the police and councils must be policed by the public and kept in line by the public when they're implementing this draconian legislation. If you want to see more of that in the article, you'll see exactly what powers they've been given and what they are obliged to put into force with these local authorities. So that's really worth taking a look at. Next on the show, I want to talk about government organised protest. This is another article on windowsontheworld.net. So we've all heard the sound bites, end austerity, stop the cuts, and all the other slogans that have absolutely no effect when the protests are run by the government, and this is called controlling the narrative. So let's look at the biggest protest organisation, which is the People's Assembly. Now, this has been carefully planned by those working inside and alongside the government to an extent, is to safeguard the public and minimise the need for the police and security services to stage violence and disruption to shut things down, which is what pretty much always happens in protests all over the world. So now this well used and it's pretty tired exercise with agent provocateur police dressed in black as anarchists has been used for years, and they actually turn up at every protest, and they're usually there seen rattling railings or hurling abuse at the police, basically trying to get the thing shut down. Now these people need to be unmasked really and exposed for what they are, because they're actually working against the public and the interests of nobody. They work for those who are trading the UK as a commodity with the people as securitized assets. So they're helping to build the national security and financial structure of the country, which is the political agenda, but they're not really working for the people. There's plenty of examples of these agent provocateurs on YouTube. Now, after the last election, if the people think that voting for one of the major parties will change anything, then you're still at kindergarten stage in facing reality now, because the last elections, it's very dubious of how Cameron got in, with the votes going missing, etc. That was reported. That may be just a conspiracy theory. But when we look at who the biggest funders of the Conservative Party are, including Paolo Zabludovich, who's is an Israeli arms dealer. His father was an Israeli arms dealer. They have a different national interest than the people in this country. So that definitely needs to be questioned. And of course, controlling the narrative is what we're talking about here. So the public need to unmask these people who are turning up at protests as anarchists. That would be really, really useful. And it's happened in America. You can see examples of that. The People's Assembly protests were tried out using the public as extras in a police control exercise months ago. The organisers are safeguarding the national interest and financial interests of the UK. Now that's their job. This is all very easy to find out with a little investigation into who's running these events. This show is not criticising those who are involved in organising these events. It's their job, and in some ways they are working to safeguard the public. But these people know that these protests are just for show. They're a day out and a bit of distraction. Again, just controlling the narrative. That's all we're doing here. It's very surprising that the general public have not cottoned on to the fact that these public protests in this country achieve nothing. Remember Iraq, 1 million people on the street, had no effect whatsoever. The agenda will carry on. Now, what I'm thinking is if people spent the time reading and empowering themselves instead of holding placards, there would be quite a change in what is called controlling the narrative. In other words, people would be less compliant in the way they think. Another thing to look at is Delphi technique, which we've covered in quite some depth, especially with Deborah Tavares. You can see her videos on YouTube of how public meetings are controlled by consensus with a professional facilitator there. Now, Delphi technique controls the agenda in organisations and every form of public consultation these days. So these so-called protests give the illusion of what people call democracy. We've had several videos that we made about the Occupy movement. One's called the Puppet Masters of Occupy, and we've got the Puppet Masters of Occupy revisited up there as well. And these clearly show how Occupy was taken over, divided and ruled with professional facilitators who came in to destroy the groups, got them all infighting, and then they brought in their own agenda, which was Agenda 21, sustainable development, all the Occupy sloganeering turned into climate change, and banal, very, very banal little catchphrases that people repeated as mantras. Now, their video, the Inside Occupy and the Bank of Ideas, and we've got the Puppet Masters of Occupy and the Puppet Masters of Occupy Revisited. These are really worth watching, and they're linked to the article Government Organised Protests on Windows on the World. And if you look at the Puppet Masters of Occupy, the woman in this video is a trained change agent with a co-facilitator. Now, Occupy St Paul's was taken over by government agents and undercover police very, very quickly. So what's the solution here? Well, knowledge is power. The solution to the looting can only be found in knowledge of how the system really works, and not the childishly simple sound bites and sort of time wasting presented by these protests and dumbed down media. Now, I've got a quote here, and it's from a document by a change agent organisation called Unlimited, UN Limited, which I've covered on the show. There's a show called The Big Society Unveiled, and we go into what they're about. I also did some filming outside the Tavistock Institute. This is the quote from Unlimited in 2011. This is a parliamentary document and it's linked to the article on the site, Government Organised Protests. Here's the quote. "The impact of reductions will be one of anger, the degree of which is yet to be realised. As the reality of reduced services hit, people will rise to action. The key to big society succeeding is to galvanise this energy." Now what they're saying there is control the narrative. We must make it look as though everyone agrees to these changes that we're making with our change agents. But the public are wising up to that a bit. These people come in into organisations or local areas to bring in Agenda 21 or new plans such as these mini Holland schemes, and there is a backlash now because people, as I stated earlier, have not been consulted. That's the big society, and it's done by consensus. So there's now thousands of change agents working against the interests of the public and in the interests of this consensus big society promised by Mr. Cameron. And yes, you can see our mini Holland schemes equals fake green fascism. That's a show we did about the mini Holland and how it's being basically enforced on people. It's about getting rid of cars and private property rights, because they're building mass sustainable housing, which is part ownership, so you never own it. There's a lot to Agenda 21, and I haven't got time to go into that here, but we've got many shows that deal with it, and there's some brilliant information out there. I've linked a lot of these videos to the articles that we're talking about. So if you're the United Nations, the IMF and the Knights of Malta, then it's necessary to control the population while appearing to give them a voice. So check out our article and videos on the big society for more info on how this works at every level of public consultation in the UK. Now it's genius simplicity, this. Controlling both sides of a debate works every time, and people still think they're participating. So it's basically like, it's your protest, so enjoy it. You know, stop the cuts, end austerity, let's just have a day out. And the article finishes with Russell Brand being heckled at a People's Assembly protest, so maybe there is some hope out there that people aren't that easily manipulated anymore. So another article on windowsontheworld.net is titled "The IMF," that's the International Monetary Fund, United Nations and Vatican Cabal, and how these organisations are linked together. There's several videos there linked, including a great introduction to all this by John Anthony. It's called Agenda 21 Explained. But this article and the public domain documents that are in the article should help to make sense of why and how a global action plan can be implemented by the IMF, UN and Vatican. The United Nations and the Pope are in agreement on the climate change agenda and are now uniting to further the goals of Agenda 21 or sustainable development. This is a worldwide programme implemented locally, as we know, in the UK through your local council. It actually means privatisation of all assets. This is eventually the aim, including water. And food rationing is another thing which will be a result of the Agenda 21 policies. Water rationing and food shortages are already in the pipeline and being talked about. And you can check out our videos linked into the article on Stealing Water for Profit and Power by Deborah Tavares, and Who's Running America and the Cap. And this will show you again what we've been talking about with consensus reality being enforced on the public. So the Vatican and Agenda 21, now the UN and the Pope are meeting later this year to discuss combating climate change. So the Vatican have now taken sides with the man-made global warming lie. The Vatican already made some very bold assumptions in the past through their papal bulls. This one of 1302 is Pope Boniface VIII, and this is a papal bull called Unam Sanctum. It says, "Urged by faith, we are obliged to believe and to maintain that the Church is one, holy, Catholic and also apostolic. We believe in her firmly, and we confess with simplicity that outside of her there is neither salvation nor the remission of sins. Furthermore, we declare, we proclaim, we define that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff. It's very interesting they used creature there. But this really is almost like a blueprint for Agenda 21. This was from 1302. They're creating a new kind of original sin, which is climate change. So we all have to feel guilty that we're polluting the earth, when it's actual fact it's the people who are implementing this who have been polluting the earth to bring this in. And that's all available in like the Iron Mountain document, which is available on YouTube. It's basically how you create these scenarios for this to be played out. It's called the Hegelian dialectic, or problem reaction solution. So the UN and its agencies, including the Vatican, are implementing the biggest mass depopulation and restructuring of the world's resources in human history, which is very interesting with that papal bull, because that's exactly what the Vatican did, and they claimed the whole world for themselves under the pontiff and brought in the idea of original sin, and climate change is the new original sin. So here's how it works. The IMF, UN and Vatican are all parts of the same cabal, and in the article we have the links there. So for instance, the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service in the United States, is not a US government agency. Well, that's very strange, isn't it? It's an agency of the IMF. That's very interesting. So the IMF is an agency of the United Nations. That's from Black's Law Dictionary. So the International Monetary Fund is an agency of the UN. The US Treasury is now the IMF. That's very interesting too. You can see all the links on the article. So to see how the UN and their agencies are immune to international law, there's an excerpt from a United Nations Convention on the Privileges and Immunities of the Specialised Agencies. And there's a link to the full article. Now, the agencies of the specialised agencies of the UN are all listed here. So we've got here the International Labour Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, the International Civil Aviation Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the World Health Organization, the Universal Postal Union, the International Telecommunication Union, and any other agency in relationship with the United Nations in accordance with Articles 57 and 63 of the Charter. Now that's very interesting, and you can scroll down through that article, you can read it all. Now there's some clauses here that are especially important when we're talking about the United Nations. It says the specialised agencies, which are all those that I've named, including the IMF, their property and assets, wherever located and by whomsoever held, shall enjoy immunity from every form of legal process, except insofar as in any particular case they have expressly waived their immunity. It is, however, understood that no waiver of immunity shall extend to any measure of execution. So that basically says they are above the law. They're above international law. In section 5, it says the premises of the specialised agencies shall be inviolable. The property and assets of the specialised agencies, wherever located and by whomsoever held, shall be immune from search, requisition, confiscation, expropriation, and any other form of interference, whether by executive, administrative, judicial or legislative action. So that's a very, very interesting article to look at when we're trying to explain how these organisations are linked together. So we've got the Vatican, the United Nations and the International Monetary Fund. And if you can link those together in your mind, then you get a pretty good idea of what's going on with the Knights of Malta overseeing all this. So that's it from Windows on the World this week. It's quite heavy going, but I think those articles explain an awful lot about what's going on in the world. Thanks for joining us on Windows on the World. Remember, keep watching those, watching us, watching Windows on the World. We'll see you soon.